The genre of side-scrolling beat-em-ups was at a height in the early 1990s. Initially popularised in the arcades by games such as Renegade, Golden Axe and Double Dragon, the genre eventually made it onto home consoles, where arcade ports of these games, alongside new ones such as River City Ransom, continued the popularity of the genre. One of the most fondly remembered and one of the best examples of this genre appeared in 1991 on the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis in the US. Let's take a look at the series that became the benchmark for side-scrolling beat-em-ups on consoles. It's a video game Odyssey for Streets of Rage. Streets of Rage, known as Bare Knuckle in Japan, debuted in 1991 with Streets of Rage on the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis. The story focuses on three young cops in a crime-infested city where nearly everyone, the police included, has been brought and bribed by a criminal syndicate. These three quit the force and decide to clean up the streets themselves. These three ex-cops are the three playable characters: Axel Stone, Blaze Fielding, and Adam Hunter. Each character has their own fighting style and strengths, which allows players to experiment and find their favourite. Each character also had the special move, which called in their few remaining friends of the police to fire a mortar onto the screen, killing all enemies or doing major damage to bosses. The game has 8 levels set in different parts of the city, with a boss waiting at the end of each stage. Eventually, you arrive at the Syndicate's headquarters to defeat the final boss, Mr. X. One of the most interesting parts of the game is the fact that it has multiple endings. When you arrive at Mr. X, he presents you with a choice: to become his right-hand man and to rule the city with him together. If you answer no, you will fight Mr. X as the final boss. But if you select yes, you will be sent back 2 levels and be forced to redo them at a higher difficulty, eventually having to reach Mr. X until you refuse his offer. In 2-player cooperative mode, it becomes even more interesting. If one of you answers yes and the other no, you will have to fight each other to the death. If the person who answers no wins, you will have to fight Mr. X, similar to 1 player. If the person answering yes wins, they can fight Mr. X and become leader of the syndicate, essentially reaching the bad ending of the game. Overall, Streets of Rage is a solid side-scrolling beat-em-up for those wanting that arcade feel on their home consoles. The graphics, music and character designs are all good, and while the difficulty may be a bit too harsh in places, its solid gameplay and multiple characters make it a fun game to play and replay. However, everything about the game is overshadowed and surpassed by its sequel. But before we move on to that, we should probably look at the different ports of Streets of Rage that made it onto various systems. Streets of Rage was also released on the Sega Master System in 1991. Despite the limitations of the 8-bit console, the game is fairly faithful to the Mega Drive version, retaining all of the playable characters and stages, and while the graphics have received a downgrade, still look decent for an 8-bit console. The most glaring missing feature is the lack of a 2-player option, which is one of the big draws for this genre. However, the most interesting thing about this version is it contains a unique boss. On stage 6, instead of refighting the 2 of the bosses from stage 2, like you do in the Mega Drive version, you instead fight a boss who can only be described as an elderly circus ringmaster who fires missiles from a huge cannon strapped to his back. The Game Gear version of Streets of Rage is very similar to the Master System, both being 8-bit consoles, but there are a number of things cut to fit on the smaller storage of Game Gear cartridges. Most notably, only Axel and Blaze are playable characters, leaving Adam absent. The game also only has 5 levels, omitting stages 2, 4 and 7. The factory boss is again different. Instead of being the big claw or ringmaster cannon guy, it is a repeat of the stage 2 boss, or stage 4 in the other versions. Despite all these cutbacks, the Game Gear version does have one advantage over the Master System version, in that it has the 2-player mode, done by linking 2 Game Gears together, which is pretty cool if you could find someone with another Game Gear and enough batteries to last between you. The Master System and Game Gear versions also feel much more difficult compared to the Mega Drive version. This is due mostly to the enemies often attacking instantly when they get into range of you, leaving little opportunity to strike first, alongside enemies being able to surround you and take off large chunks of your health in a devastating and unfair combo. An honourable mention should also go to Streets of Rage for the Sega CD, which is essentially just the Mega Drive version with slightly cleaner graphics and, oddly enough, new voice clips for attacks and death grunts. How odd. Despite all these different versions, the Mega Drive version still remains the definitive one, and is the one you have probably played as it is the only one ported to other consoles and included in all subsequent collections. Another honourable mention can also go to the Streets of Rage LCD game, released in the forms of the Arcade Pocket and Tiger Electronic handheld. If you've played one of these LCD games, you'll know exactly how this game works, as they all have you attacking enemies that appear on all sides of the screen until you face the boss. The Streets of Rage version is apparently one of the rarest versions though, so if you find one going cheap, it would certainly be worth picking up. Now, finally, we can move on. Following Streets of Rage's success, a sequel was released on the Mega Drive at the beginning of 1993, at the height of the Mega Drive's popularity, and boy does it deliver. Streets of Rage 2 is everything a sequel should be. It improves on the original in every single way, creating what is easily one of the best games in the Mega Drive library. Set 1 year after the original, Mr. X has returned and taken control of the city. To make matters worse, he has also kidnapped Adam, one of the playable characters from the first game. Axel and Blaze once again head out onto the streets to take down Mr. X's crime syndicate. Joined by 2 new playable characters, Wrestler Max and Adam's kid brother Skate, you take on 8 new stages packed with enemies old and new. It is truly hard to find a criticism of this game. The gameplay really perfects the side-scrolling beat-em-up genre, with every hit and attack sounding and feeling significant, and a fantastic variety of stages and enemies to test your skills in. All the difficulty levels feel perfectly appropriate, and the soundtrack has become the stuff of legends. If you want to talk about the greatest games of the entire 16-bit era, Streets of Rage 2 has to be worth more than a passing mention. Like the original Streets of Rage, the sequel got a Game Gear port. Again, in an effort to fit the game onto the smaller cartridge, only 6 of the 8 stages make it onto this version, as well as only 3 of the playable characters, omitting Max entirely, even from the ending cutscenes. While the gap between the 16-bit and 8-bit versions of the original were not particularly huge, in the sequel they are glaringly obvious. The graphics are pretty dire, and even though a good amount of the new enemies make it onto this version, it simply cannot compete with the Mega Drive version. It also suffers from the same cheapness that the previous Game Gear version had, with enemies aggressively attacking you, leaving little room to counterattack. This makes the game feel quite unfair, particularly compared to how spot on the Mega Drive version was with regards to its various difficulty levels. Streets of Rage 2 cemented Streets of Rage as a franchise to be reckoned with. As mentioned, it has become renowned as one of the best games from the 16-bit era, and also gained the series a solid popularity and renown, leading to such things as a novel adaptation released with an issue of the UK magazine Sega Force, as well as a returning comic strip in the UK's Sonic the Comic. The stories in these comics did not follow the games closely, but were still popular enough to warrant 4 separate stories in total, released through the comic's early run. How do you follow up the perfect sequel? This was certainly an unenviable task the developers faced, and with this weight upon their shoulders, they produced Streets of Rage 3, which was released in 1994. The story features the return of Axel, Blaze and Skate, as well as newcomer Dr. Zahn, as they set about cleaning up the city and stopping a series of bombs from going off. The core gameplay is still very much Streets of Rage, but it also adds in some new elements to keep the fighting fresh, such as sprinting, rolling, and a new special mechanic. The gameplay itself is also more varied, featuring some interesting set pieces such as being chased by a bulldozer, and timed events on levels that will choose which out of the multiple endings you will wind up at. Technically, there are 2 versions of Streets of Rage 3. The Japanese release, Bare Knuckle 3, had a very different story. A chemical weapons attack has devastated the city, leaving mass casualties, and our heroes have to stop a similar attack from being carried out again. The Japanese version also features Ash, the boss of level 1, who is, clearly, meant to be a very stereotypical homosexual character, who was replaced in the worldwide release in level 1 with Shiva. Ash was also a secret character that was only playable in the Japanese release, alongside Shiva and Ryu, who were unlockable in all releases. Streets of Rage 3, released outside of Japan, apart from removing any sign of Ash, also took out any reference to chemical attacks, and focused more on the plot of the crime syndicate replacing city officials with robot doppelgangers. Other minor differences, such as the recolour of characters' outfits, are also present. The biggest difference, however, is undoubtedly the difficulty. The worldwide release significantly increased the difficulty of the game, by both increasing the number of enemies on screen and also nearly doubling their health bars. This made the game incredibly difficult, even more so in the time sections of the game, such as in the final boss. The game would also stop at level 5 on easy difficulty, meaning that there really was no easy way around this version. The added complexity of Streets of Rage 3 gives a fresh take on the franchise and justifies itself as a worthy sequel, but this might also be why it simply isn't as highly regarded as its predecessor. Streets of Rage 2 was a perfectly balanced game that was at its best when you could just beat enemies up without a care in the world. Streets of Rage 3 introduces enemies and stage mechanics that require a certain strategy, and for some that is going to ruin the purity of the genre. While the music is still good, it just isn't as memorable as the previous game. And all of these things come together to mean that Streets of Rage 3, though a good game in its own right, just doesn't quite escape the shadow of its predecessor. After Streets of Rage 3, the series appears to vanish into the wilderness. There were some attempts to bring the series back on the Dreamcast and other consoles, but all of these attempts were cancelled very early in development. Perhaps a factor in this was that the side-scrolling beat-em-up never really made it out of the 16-bit era intact. The genre never really made it into the era of 3D games, and even when Sega went out of the home console business, they famously neglected their established IPs. Fans, however, did step in to fill the void, with the open source engine Beats of Rage and the comprehensive Streets of Rage remake. There were some places to get your Streets of Rage fix if you knew where to look, but a true sequel was far off, and it would take until 2020 for that sequel to arrive. Before that, however, a little known release happened which you may have missed. Bare Knuckle Mobile was released in Japan as a mobile-only title. It is a remake of the original Streets of Rage that is done in the style of Streets of Rage 2, updating the characters and stages to look more like the ever-popular sequel. Despite the rather iffy controls you might expect from a mobile game, it's actually a fairly solid remake that looks great and does the game justice, and it's a shame it isn't available anywhere else. It only features 2 playable characters, Axel and Blaze, although Adam guides the player in a new tutorial mode and can also appear as an ally in the game if you pick up a support item. As with the other Streets of Rage ports, the Stage 6 boss is different. It's Harakiri, a army samurai ninja hybrid? I didn't think we could get any weirder than the circus man with the cannon on his back. Anyway, I think this is a pretty good version of the game and recreates the original without straying too far from it, and is a curiosity well worth checking out. Anyway, the sequel. Streets of Rage 4, produced by Guard Crush Games and Lizardcube and published by Dotemu, is the Streets of Rage sequel most fans will have been after for so long. Set 10 years after the defeat of Mr. X in Streets of Rage 3, the criminal syndicate is on the rise again, headed this time by Mr. X's children, the Y-Twins. Axel and Blaze return to clean up the streets, with Adam's daughter Cherry, and eventually Adam himself, as well as Dr. Zahn's apprentice Floyd, to once again brave the Streets of Rage. The game is full of references and reimaginings of everything a Streets of Rage fan could possibly want, as well as adding in new features, such as a combo system and stage-specific scores for those who want to get the best high score possible. Alongside this, the game also allows you to unlock versions of characters from previous games, so you can see how they stack up in comparison. A DLC, Mr. X's Nightmare, also added new playable characters, and a survival mode, again increasing the scope of the game. Maybe there are some people who would have preferred a pixel art style to the hand-drawn style that the game goes with, but personally, I don't see that as an issue. Streets of Rage 4 makes a lot of effort to bring in all of the elements of the Streets of Rage franchise together to satisfy long-term fans, while also innovating and carving out its own path to create a worthy sequel. Streets of Rage is back with a bang, and who knows, maybe with a resurgence in the demand for retro games, the king of side-scrolling beat-em-ups could certainly continue for years to come. Finally, another little curiosity. On October 17th, 2020, as part of their 60th anniversary celebrations, Sega released Streets of Kamurocho on Steam, a free download which reimagines the Yakuza series as a Streets of Rage level, playing as either Kiryu Kazuma, Goro Majima, or Ichiban Kasuga if you unlock him by beating the game once. You walk through the streets of Kamurocho beating up punks, in true Streets of Rage style. While it's only a short game comprised of one level repeating endlessly, it is a nice nod to two of Sega's most popular franchises that recreates the setting of the Yakuza games in a good amount of 16-bit detail, and a true ode to one of the best of Sega on their 60th birthday. Here's to many more birthdays, and maybe many more Streets of Rage games. Thanks for checking out this video game odyssey on Streets of Rage. If you'd like to see me play through various video game series, be sure to follow me on Twitch, and I'll see you for the next video game odyssey.